hand appears over a whiteboard and draws a person with a cane. One with crutches. In a wheelchair. The ASL sign for I love you. Other smiling people. The words The Journey to the Americans with Disabilities Act. The resistance of disabled Americans. The hand erases the image.
Even after the Americans with Disabilities Act, disabled people still live in a world built for the able-bodied. Despite the Civil Rights Act of 1964, people with disabilities were not granted equal opportunity under the law until 1990 with the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This was groundbreaking legislation for disability rights activism, the first comprehensive civil rights law pertaining to people with disabilities.
George Bush Sr. signing the ADA.
But the disability rights movement followed a long and winding path to this point. The first U.S. law providing support to people with disabilities arrived in August of 1776, just after American independence, and gave support to those with significant injuries from the Revolutionary War. 1886 marked the founding of what is now Gallaudet University, the first university in the world for people with disabilities, and likely one of their only possibilities for education at this time. The first recorded arrest for violating the ugly law, ordinances preventing anyone unsightly from appearing in public spaces, took place in 1867. Anyone dirty, diseased, mentally or physically disabled could easily be arrested. The last of these laws were not repealed until 1974. In 1935, the League of the Physically Handicapped was founded to protest discrimination by the Works Progress Administration. Job applications were stamped with PH, physically handicapped, which led to a loss of work. The League held a 9-day sit-in against this action. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, in addition to enforcing the voting rights of minorities, gave disabled people the opportunity to bring along an able-bodied reader for their inaccessible ballot. The 1972 Mills v. Board of Education case in D.C. guaranteed every child, regardless of the severity of their disability, a free public education. President Nixon's veto of the Rehabilitation Act, also in 1972, led to an 80-person sit-in on Madison Avenue, stopping traffic. The next year, the Rehabilitation Act was passed, becoming the first federal civil rights protection in the U.S. for people with disabilities. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 strived to level the playing field for disabled people, giving greater opportunity for independent living and self-determination. This act prohibits discrimination based on disability on any federal level. This was one of the first legal actions towards usage of the social model of disability. Most doctrine in the West follows the medical model of disability, the assumption that a disabled person is broken and all efforts should go towards fixing them. If you cannot be fixed, this model would suggest any inabilities you have are due to your brokenness. The social model of disability was created to contest this model. Perhaps the stairs are the obstacle to a wheelchair user entering a building, rather than the wheels that give them their mobility. Acknowledgement of the one-sidedness of our culture is the founding rhetoric of not only the social model, but also theories of intersectional feminism. In 1977, Section 504, an amendment to the Rehabilitation Act, was proposed yet struggled to be passed. The insufficient progress prompted disability activists to organize a sit-in in San Francisco's office of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. The sit-in comprised over 150 people with varying disabilities and lasted 28 days, the longest sit-in in a federal building ever in the United States. This was a major act of resistance. Under the medical model, these people are patients. They supposedly had no business being outside of a hospital room, and yet they staged a month-long protest, putting their disabilities on display.
A blue figure's arm falls off. A Band-Aid attempts to fix it but fails as he looks away, clearly wanting to leave. Later, he sits at home, bored.
Their doggedness brought the disabled out of the home place and into the public eye. Disabled people are often relegated to the private sphere, staying protected at home because of their assumed frailty. Many are institutionalized from a young age, either sent to boarding schools or inpatient care facilities because their parents feel unable to cope with their disability. The net effect is a negative one to the disabled community. They are kept segregated from the rest of the world, outside of even the breadth of the public and private spheres. These people suffer similarly to women in the 1960s, suffering from the problem that has no name, depression from being separated from the social world and confined to the home. Institutionalization only aggravates the problem, separating disabled people from even their families and putting their lives in the control of people herders. The Section 504 protest was an attempt by disabled citizens to reclaim their agency and push the government to recognize independent living as a quality of life issue. The first draft of the Americans with Disabilities Act emerged in 1988. While the Rehabilitation Act and Section 504 regulated the use of federal funds, the ADA was presented to require the same protections at the state and local level. Similarly to Section 504, the movement of the legislation through the approval process was tedious. Over 1,000 protesters appeared in Washington in March of 1990, pushing for the immediate passage of the act. Over 60 of the protesters, all crutch, cane, or wheelchair users, abandoned their mobility aids and pulled, dragged, and crawled their way up the 83 Capitol building steps. In contrast to the civilized sit-in pushing for the Rehabilitation Act, the Capitol crawl was an aggressive display for the rights of disabled Americans. The protesters dragged themselves up the stairs to the Capitol building, literally overcoming the obstacles our able-bodied rhetoric has created. This was not an overcoming of their disability, but proving to the watching world that their disability was a socially created problem, not an inherent one. The primary entrance to their capital was inaccessible. The exclusion of disabled people would no longer be seen as the choice of the individual. Our country is and was biased against disabled bodies. Their demonstration brought disabled lives into the public eye in a massive way, hoping to destigmatize their lives and bring equality.
Blue protests.
The passage of the ADA brought many more civil protections for disabled people, but our world is far from perfect. Innumerable other protests and lawsuits also contributed to the fight for equality.
1904 Helen Keller Graduates College. 1940 National Federation of the Blind and the American Foundation of the Physically Handicapped are formed. 1962 Edward Roberts attends Berkeley. 1968 The Architectural Barriers Act. 1970 Judy Heumann. 1976 Celeste Tate Harrington.
Even after this legislation, disabled people are still marginalized and taught that they have a lesser future. Disabled adults are treated like children. Public buildings lack reasonable access. Inclusivity workshops have only flat, printed paper handouts. And the one disabled figure everyone knows, Helen Keller, was an advocate of eugenics. We have a long way to go.
Blue and red. A blind friend. Go to a talk. Green comes out with paper handouts, no braille. He is oblivious. Blue is bemused and red is upset. Blue drops the papers and leaves with red as the talk begins.